Thank you for joining us and thank you for joining us online. Just to tell you that we will be starting 5 to 8 minutes late as we're still waiting for the longest speaker. Thank you.
Director at Chili's on Wheels, and it's great to be here with you today. The land politically designated as New York City is the homeland of the Lenape people, who were violently displaced due to European settler colonialism over 400 years. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation from their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples connected from time immemorial to this land on which we now gather. The Lenape are a diasporic people who remain closely connected with this land and are its rightful stewards. New York City has one of the largest urban native populations in the United States, and the Lenape people are still very much here with us today. It is crucial to recognize and fully understand the extensive history that has culminated in our present residency on this land and take responsibility for our role in that history. Land acknowledgements are not merely a matter of the past or of historical context. They are part of the healing because colonialism is an ongoing process that demands that we remain acutely aware of our present involvement in it. We must all recognize our collective responsibility and relationship to the indigenous people of this land and throughout the world, and make our legacy one of reconciliation, repair, and rematriation. And I welcome you to make a donation to the American Indian Community House, which was founded right here in New York, and helps and supports indigenous people of this land, because land acknowledgement without actions are just empty words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloísa, for the powerful words, and welcome everyone. It's great to gather here. Thank you for joining us today for this 90 minutes session, where we will explore the potential of healthy diets and plant-based solution for a 1.5 future. So my name is Raphael Podselver. I work with the food awareness organization ProVeg International in Berlin. Our organization promotes healthy plant-rich diets and protein diversification. That means like increasing the consumption and production of legumes, beans, plant-based alternatives, but also helping develop products around fermentation, cultivated meat, etc. And we believe that a shift towards more plant-rich diets is a key solution to tackle many of the current challenges that we are facing, from biodiversity loss, climate change, non-communicable diseases, to guaranteeing healthy, nutritious diets and food security for everyone. So first, I would like to thank everyone for coming, but also, like, of course, like the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation and Steve Chiu for welcoming us in this beautiful space this morning. And I would also like to, of course, and I would like to thank Mercy for Animals and Compassion in World Farming and the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, of course, for partnering on this. Foods for providing the dumplings that we are eating this lunch, sustainable jackfruit dumplings, so it's very tasty and very interesting. So let us start today with a few numbers, and maybe with the most important topic, food security. 2 months ago, the SOFI report reminded us that approximately 2.4 billion individuals, largely women and residents of rural areas, did not have access to nutritious, safe and nutrition food in 2022. So it's definitely an extremely alarming numbers, and we see it every day again in the SOFI report, but this is something that we definitely have to tackle at first. On emissions, we know that food systems represent around 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emission, and animal agriculture is responsible for 20% of emission. David, if you can join us like here right next, that would be perfect. Thank you. Yeah, around 80% of the world's farmland is used for livestock, even though these products only provide 37% of protein and 18% of calories. So our current production patterns and methods of meat production are not only very inefficient, they're also driving greenhouse gas emission, biodiversity loss, and food insecurity, not to mention future risks, zoonoses, pandemics, AMRs, etc. The challenge we face is that meat consumption, according to the FAO, is expected to double until 2050. And we also know that even if we would phase out fossil fuels tomorrow, the current production pattern of proteins would not allow us to achieve the Paris Agreement. The IPCC also reminds us in every report of the climate mitigation potential of reducing our dependency on animal-sourced foods and unlocking the co-benefits of like more plant-rich diets in general. Here's a quote just from last year's IPCC report on mitigation.
Based foods, particularly pulses, nuts, fruits, and vegetables, could lead to substantial reduction of greenhouse gas emissions
as compared to current dietary patterns in most industrialized countries, while also providing health benefits and reducing mortality from diet-related non-communicable diseases. So how do we unlock the potential of healthy plant-rich diets and protein diversification? I think we're here today because many of us acknowledge that we have like a unique opportunity this year with COP28, because for the first time we will have a climate conference that will focus also intensively on food systems transformation. And it's a topic that we're trying to push within the COP process for years, and we're very happy to see like first successes here and first initiatives. Last year we saw already at COP27 some important discussion and some important processes, the FAST initiative of course, but also like the presence of 4 pavilions in the blue zone, the different food pavilions, that was also a premiere. And this included also of course the Food for Climate pavilions, to which like we are very happy to have the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, Compassion in World Farming, and Mercy for Animals part of the consortium this year again in Dubai. This year, COP28 will also walk the talk and has committed to provide much more plant-based diets, plant-based dishes, sorry, in its offer. So it's also something very interesting to see that will have like, you know, also like walking the talk and like showing like the impact by also putting the emissions on the dishes, etc. So really connecting the delegates with the food they eat at COP. And we're very happy to also like be part of the campaign by Food at COP and Yongo that was pushing for like that was pushing the presidency to have like I would say a more like a menu at the canteens and at the different like catering spots that is more in phase also with climate change discussion. The COP28 presidency has also committed to step up ambitions on food systems transformation by shaping several important initiatives. We know, of course, of the Leaders' Declaration. We know like that Aim for Climate is also a big topic for the UAE, of course. And we also heard that there will be also some actions and discussions around the methane pledge and the deforestation commitments made in Glasgow. So again, a lot of things to talk about. But one of the processes that gets also a lot of attention these days is, of course, the FAO roadmap for 1.5 Celsius. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, David Laborde. David, thank you for making it today. I know you must have a very busy schedule this week. You are the director of the Agri-Food Economics Division of the FAO since, I think, February 2023. You work on a number of flagship publications, such as, of course, the SOFI report, which I just mentioned at the beginning, the State of Food Security.
State of Food and Agriculture, and you lead the division's work on policy monitoring, policy reform, and real
incentive to support agri-food system transformation. Before joining FAO, you were for 16 years at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute of CGIAR in Washington, D.C. David, in the next 6 to 8 minutes, can you share with us the thinking a little bit behind the roadmap, the goals of this document, what we hope to achieve with this roadmap, and of course, like maybe some insights on the role that you could foresee for like plant-rich diets, healthy plant-rich diets, or alternative proteins in aligning food systems with the 1.5 goal of Paris. So David, I will let you you'll have to stand up and be good.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the lunch. Okay. Now, so it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this roadmap that is about keeping some climate target, and for the sake of optimism, we are going to say it's 1.5, as well as deliver on food security and nutrition. Because one of the challenges we face today is, for a long time, these two targets have been managed independently, sometimes in opposition. You have people that say we need to feed the planet, and some people that say actually we need to save the planet and protect the climate. Now, we will never get a political consensus if we continue to have this silo approach. And This process started actually early last year when, for once, we get the private sectors, investors that say to FAO, please come with a global roadmap on that. You are the UN institution in charge of food and agriculture. So we want to hear from you in terms of providing a consistent vision on that, like the International Energy Agency has done for the energy sector. So we would like that you do it for the agriculture, agri-food system, as we call it at FAO. And at the same time, FAO is used to work with the Ministry of Agriculture that are going to be key to engage in this transition and in this reform. You know, you cannot come and say to the farmers, you are killing the planet. No, we would like you to do something different. No, that's not a good message. And so the Ministry of Agriculture for a long time was looking at all this climate discussion as not good news, more constraints, when actually farmers all around the world already have very hard life, you know. If you think about suicide rate in Europe or in India, they are actually higher in Europe among farmers than in India. So everywhere in the world, even when you have countries supporting you, government, you have a hard life. So, you know, you need to get a positive message. The Ministry of Environment, the climate negotiators say, as it hasn't been said, you are not going to achieve your mission if you are not serious about agri-food system. And overall, it means that you will have to spend more money, both on adaptation and mitigation in agri-food system. And that's common ground with the Ministry of Agriculture. And then the investors say, but you know, we have so many pathways, so many options. Everyone come with a gazillion of solutions. And so it's confusion. And what the private sector doesn't like is confusion. You don't invest when you don't know where you are going to be in 5 or 10 years. So we try to bridge this gap and to come with this vision so that first both coming with target for 2030, we have it. It's Agenda 2030, the SDG. But you know, what is a vision for food security and nutrition after that? SDG didn't talk about obesity, for instance, when for half of the world that's going to become one of the major concerns. But we still have 10% of the world that didn't eat enough. So we need to articulate this. And when we think about agri-food system also, we need not to think about just GHG. We have a specific story for methane. We have a specific story for NO2 and a specific story for carbon. And we need a bit of complexity in this world if we want actually to change it. We cannot oversimplify. Oversimplification is going to lead to problems. And that brings me to the type of solution. Some, of course, are going to be about how we produce food, about better technology, better knowledge, but also how much food we need. But also we will need to act on the demand side. We cannot solve all the challenges we have just by asking farmers to do A, B, or C, or provide them miracle technology. If consumers still want to overconsume waste food and actually maybe not have the good diets, we will not solve the problem. So really that's this transversal approach that is needed. And what is the role of this? So do we call it alternative protein? At FAO, we don't like it. We want alternative to meat. Because the world has enough proteins. We don't want to replace one protein by another. We want to replace part of what the good part of animal products are by other alternatives. And some can be traditional one. I mean, we have a number of leguminous that can play a role. We can innovate also. But at the end, our message is not also to say, you know, animal products are bad. Actually, in a large part of the world, we will need to get this increase of animal product. When you are a kid in Africa, the first way to accept many micronutrients is when your father, your mother, is mixing a bit of meat in your plate when you are small, okay? And that's the reality. They are not going to get fortified food, not for the next 30, 40 years. But in Africa, in average, the amount of meat that is consumed is less than 7 kilograms per habitant. In Europe, in part of Latin America, North America, we are 10 times, 15 times. So there is time for this rebalancing, okay? And it's not just to say to everyone, stop eating meat, stop eating milk. It's to say some people, but you need to make room for others. You need to rethink what you eat in order to give opportunity to others. But it's not also going to happen by miracle. It's not by, you know, shaming people in the US and Europe, oh, you eat too much meat, then tomorrow people will have meat in Democratic Republic of Congo. So we need to invest. We need to do this transition. And that's the type of, you know, integrated solution we try to have. And what the roadmap want to give is really this global picture, this global vision. So we have one planet, we have one climate, And that first, let's agree on where do we stand? What is the trajectory for methane? What do we want to with global amount of land? Then after countries, regions are going to develop their own solution. And beyond this nice narrative, there's also a lot of regulatory and policy to change, policy incentive in different places. And so I think I'm going already in my 7-8 minutes. So, okay. So just to conclude, in the roadmap, you will see these 8 to 10 main domain action where actually changing food consumption habits will be an important part. Now, what we know also, it's how we get there. Very difficult, actually. You know, taxing meat may play a bit, but actually the people that overconsume meat are the richest people around the world and actually sometimes within countries. And you can double the price of meat, they don't cut their consumption. So we need behavioral change. We need education. We need also products that are attractive to eat. So then you have the debate, you know, is it a substitute to meat? So it's all, as soon as you say substitute, what can be scaled up? Where do we play a role? Is it government, public procurement, school? But still, you know, keeping in mind that nutrition matters. We cannot start just because we would like some things to change than to create micronutrient shortage, especially when, for example, in stunting and wasting for kids, we are still lacking behind in many low-income countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and sorry for interrupting you in the in the process of eating your dumplings. But like, thank you for making it, and I think it's a very good point also you make about the complexity, I think, of food systems. I think, you know, we also all agree that there's no one-size-fits-all approach or like a silver bullet that will solve all problems. But there is definitely, I think, from our perspective, clearly a need, like, also to acknowledge the problems. And you know, of course, like, there is countries where like the situation is very different. But overall, in countries from the north, especially in around Europe and the US, there's so much space for like the reduction of animal source proteins and like a shift towards more healthy plant-rich protein sources that it is definitely something where I think we can also meet halfway, like on this process. But I think, yeah, it's definitely a very interesting discussion, and we look very much forward to see this roadmap discussion also at COP. We'll have the time to get back to ask you a few more questions, follow up probably afterwards. But I would like now to start like with our panel, and I would like to start with Xananine Calvillo Ramirez. So Xananine is indigenous Ngiwa, a descendant from southern Puebla. You are a community organizer, climate justice activist. I think you were also at the march on Sunday and organizing a lot of activities, and a plant-based food system advocate. You are a founder and member of several youth collective and indigenous initiatives focusing on food solidarity and environmental justice in Latin America. You are also a member of the Loss and Damage Working Group at Yongo and a board and youth partner of the Food for Climate Pavilion at COP28. So Xananine, we'll leave you the floor for 6-8 minutes, and yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would like to start as well with an acknowledgement, because there's something that I always like to remind myself, is that something that communitary organizers and communitary feminists from Latin America say, that food is political because what you eat is a political statement. And I think, how can we feed a different world if our food keeps feeding the problem? And how will all alternatives grow if indigenous communities, if youth, if we do not have access to land rights, if we do not have access to finance for all alternatives? Because I believe the solutions to the food systems already exist in Latin American indigenous communities, in youth, because we have been eating plants from centuries before the colonial process. And we have been also preserving global biodiversity. We know that 80% of global biodiversity is preserved by indigenous communities. And these farmers in indigenous communities are the ones that feed the world. And it is not factory farming, it is not industrial agribusiness which is feeding the world. It's actually people, and these people that are creating alternatives. And I also believe that in a lot of youth communities, like in my university in Mexico, we have already like solutions, because a lot of young people from the global south, we cannot like afford a lot of alternatives, but we're actually creating alternatives. In Mexico City, there are a lot of initiatives on community networks of solidarity, which create alternatives, plant-based, that are commerced and are displaced around the university. And this is a solution that I believe needs to be uplifted as well, because I have a collective that is called Legado Gaia, and in there we also plant, we like to say that we plant climate hope through urban gardens and through gardens where we create mushrooms, we plant like different alternatives for it to be something that in cities, which are like a lot of the problem as well, because cities concentrate so much resources and concentrate and demand a lot of meat as well. And so that is why young people are doing in my collective and in Mexico City, because I was talking before a lot about the land acknowledgement, because in my community, we do not have like a lot of access to land, because land is actually being given to poultry industries. It is given to livestock, it's being given to factory farming. And this is something that we have to change if we want to have more solutions, if we want to youth and indigenous youth specifically to bring these solutions to a lot of spaces and to make them grow. We do need access to that land, and we need access to finance to upscale the solutions, because actually development banks continue to invest in factory farming, and just $4.6 billion were invested from the largest multilateral development banks towards factory farming. And that is why we're also demanding that we stop financing factory farming and that we divest all this finance to youth solutions, because these solutions are the ones that are feeding the communities that have been left out, and the ones that are going to also change our food systems.
Thank you so much, Xananine. Our second speaker today is Steve Chiu. Steve, you served as the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation representative to the UN in alignment with Tzu Chi's work in disaster relief, climate action, education for global citizenship, sustainable development, and gender equality. You work to build relationships, share best practices, and develop programs with other organizations to make tangible impacts on the ground with the mission of alleviate.
So I think what I want to lift into this space is, as we think about transforming food systems, as we think about how food can help us achieve 1.5, I want to ask the question of how can we change the behavior of people, right? Recognizing from a demand side, we really do have to create this catalytic transformation, but if we do so haphazardly without really coming together intentionally, we risk duplicating efforts that have brought us to create the same problems that we find ourselves in today. And so from Tzu Chi's expertise and experience of organizing in over 128 countries around food systems transformation, I wanted to lift up some of the existing solutions, kind of like what Xananine was speaking to, of how we can already work to create holistic change in our food systems without having to have like much technological advancement, right? It's about the transformation of culture, it's about the transformation of consciousness and minds, and how we work within our communities to do this work. So first, I think our first layer of consideration is, do we see food as a commodity, or do we see it as a place to build community, right? Oftentimes, when we find ourselves in food insecurity conversations, the biggest numbers in question are, these are this many people going hungry, we need to feed a number, right? But very rarely there is conversation around how do we feed these people, to what culturally contextualized, culturally sensitive ways do we bring people together for food. And in this way of trying to meet this very urgent need of food insecurity, if we lack this understanding that food is also personal, it's cultural, and that we risk erasing this culture in the name of progress, we can oftentimes perpetuate these models of colonialism and extractionism, where we come into communities as helicopter organizations in a desperate attempt to save people, right? And so I have some friends here from the movement for community-led development who really champion a model of working hand in hand with communities to lift up what they need, right? And I think, so first of all, if we see food as commodity, we will forever be the purveyors of progress, right? But if we see food as community, like we do within Tzu Chi and other organizations here, we can really see that it's through working hand in hand with these communities to identify where their starting point is that we can begin to have this conversation. So what is that conversation we need to have if we're going to change people's behaviors, right? We need to shift, I think, 3 big key areas. The first being, how do we understand progress, success, and like well-being, right? Within like our understanding of food and nutrition, we know that a more plant-rich diet leads to healthier outcomes, less NCDs, and a general sense of like a better relationship with the natural world compared to the overconsumption of meat, right? Of course, there's nuances to that. We don't want to oversimplify and lose the complexity of how we can ensure that we lift people out of poverty through certain food system choices. However, within developing countries, there is a tendency to want to grapple towards the Western diet as a narrative of this is what progress looks like. If I can put a large slab of meat on my plate as the main dish, then I am successful, right? If I can waste food and throw it away and show you that I am rich enough to waste this food, then I am seen as successful, right? And these narratives often are tied to deeper, like almost spiritual understandings of how we relate to each other and the natural world, right? Food waste is a continuous issue, and no matter how much we innovate on a technological level, we cannot solve food waste with that alone, right? We have to change behavior. And that behavior has to first come from this understanding of what is our relationship with each other and what is our relationship with the natural world. If we can so easily discard the food that is so precious to those who are starving and hungry, what does that say about how we perceive and see these individuals? Are they part of our community or are they othered, right? And this tendency to want to other in the name of progress, I think, is something that we often reflect on and try to build community to bring people more into the fold, right? And so this is maybe a little more conceptual, but I think as we look to chart out food systems transformation, it's about championing this like inclusivity, and it's about championing a just and equitable transition, right? For those who work in factory farming operations, as we speak to the dangers of factory farming, not only to their own well-being, to the natural world, how are we ensuring that we are also coming hand in hand and saying, we also understand that your well-being, your family's well-being and livelihood is deeply tied to this harmful practice, and we have the resources and ability to empower you to go beyond this, reskill, upskill, get new green jobs, the likes. If we can't come in with that level of commitment, then I think a lot of what we say is a little bit more airy in nature, right? I'm running out of time, but I think at the end of the day, I would like to say that if we want to see progress in allowing our food systems to help achieve 1.5, we have to look at what are the values that underpin this transformation and ensure that they are grounded in notions of interdependence, compassion, empathy for each other, and a deep desire to want to truly coexist with the natural world to pass it on for future generations. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. And definitely behavioral change, like a big topic, I think, that we also are working on, like also in our regions and in the different spaces we work, community versus commodity. But I also liked, mentioning just transition, of course, because we also have to see, how we achieve like this transition, this transformation, and it has to be also, of course, by putting like farmers like at the forefront of this whole process and be farmer-centric. And I think it's definitely like one of the big topic that we'll have to tackle in the coming years. Our next speaker today is Eloísa Trinidad. Eloísa, you are an award-winning policy advocate, liberation activist, educator, and artist. As executive director at Chili's on Wheels and founder of Vegan Activist Alliance, your mission is to make plant-based diets accessible to communities in need through direct food relief, policy, education, and mentorship. And Eloísa, I'll let you the floor for 6-8 minutes.
Thank you. I don't think I'll be done in 5 minutes, so somebody has to time me. I have a lot to say. So the framework through which I work is an anti-colonial framework because I truly do believe, and as the UN has stated in previous report, colonization has been a main driver of the climate crisis and of food systems change, and not for the better. I also want to acknowledge that it is by choice and not by chance that we find ourselves in this triple planetary crisis, in this hunger crisis, as well as in this loss of biodiversity. Governments around the world and bodies and structures such as the UN have continuously failed to listen to the people, to the indigenous people, and those who are protecting our planet. And so these are very much political decisions. And while we can change the way that we eat and who we eat, it is absolutely critical that we engage in systems thinking and systems change. I was very lucky as a child to be raised in a traditional Afro-Indigenous way. My family was part of that peasant food chain that exists. We were feeding our neighbors, we were feeding each other, and although we didn't have a lot, we had land. And on that land, we were able to grow food and feed way more people than our family was made up of. And food sovereignty is a critical part of this conversation. If we do not address equity and food sovereignty and the right that people have and should have to make those decisions, we're not going to have food systems change. The global north and the global south need to be having a conversation on equity beyond just a food systems conversation. Women around the world comprise 43% of farmers, and yet they do not have the same access to land or the same protections. And so what are we doing if we do not address the youth, our elders who are passing down our knowledge, and the women who are at the front lines of feeding us as well? We need to move forward in a way of co-innovation, co-creation, and collaboration. So many times as a person that works in policy, what I see are policies drafted by people who have PhD, who have not spent a single day working on the ground with the folks, with the farmers, with the people who are distributing food. Those policies continuously fail and are not implemented because these roadmaps do not contain the input from all the stakeholders. And that is absolutely critical if we want change. We have to preserve indigenous, traditional, and peasant knowledge. For so long, we have depended on Western science to catch up to what we already know. We have this knowledge. It is part of who we are. We know that plants are medicine. And so the absolute disregard of Western science to push aside and delegitimize the knowledge that we have that I grew up with. My grandfather was able to grow pineapples in New York City. I've never seen that done before. And that only comes from that tradition. And I may be the last person in my family who has that knowledge, and after that, it will be lost, most likely. And so Western colonization has detribalized us. It has disrupted our relationship to one another, to nature, to our beyond human relatives. And in that aspect, we continue to lose indigenous knowledge for many reasons, right? Indigenous people need to move to cities to find jobs. And so it's a complex thing, but it's a very important thing that we have to talk about of how we preserve this knowledge and how modern and Western science can come together to support this traditional knowledge. We also have to ask ourselves who is in the room, who's not in the room, and who needs to be out of the room. So many times what we see, especially now, I mean, I've been going to so many sessions for the Science Summit and UNGA and all of these things, and it is elitist. The folks who need to be there are not there, and they're not even invited. I know folks who are doing tremendous, amazing work, but because they're being too radical when talking about food sovereignty and the distribution of power, they're not invited to the table because there may be a multinational corporation there that we're hand-holding while they pretend that they're feeding the world, but yeah, they're destroying our planet. And right here in the US, we have 38 million people who are food insecure. During the pandemic, that was 50 million people. So this is right here, very much local. It very much affects us. And how did we solve this issue while all of this was happening? We created the largest mutual aid network right here in New York, and it was us protecting us. It wasn't the multinational corporations that they couldn't handle the supply chain disruption. So it is absolutely critical that when we come up with these solutions, they are localized. Yes, it is challenging. We have a global food systems, and underneath that, maybe 6 or 7 that we can define. But if we don't have local solutions that involve every stakeholder, that amplify indigenous traditions and peasant knowledge, we will not get anywhere. We will continue to have conversations and be the king and queens of conversation in another meeting, in another conference. Well, I'm pretty much done with the meetings and the conference. I want change. I want concrete action. And so we must co-create, and we must move forward with the lens of equity. Otherwise, we will not reconnect to nature. This is a relationship to our planet that we have to heal. And we can give so many different stats. I mean, I have so many stats. I work on policy all day long. But governments need to be a critical part of that process as well. Subsidies throughout the world are destroying our environment, are destroying our planet. Over 90% are harmful to our planet. Right here in the US, less than 1%, I believe, goes to fruits and vegetables that we can actually eat. The rest are going to animal-based agriculture to support multinational corporations, to support the feed that is grown for these animals. And so when we sit in a room as people who are on the ground, who have the direct knowledge, and we are dismissed because we are told that these folks are feeding the world, they are not. We have people dying from the air, water, and land pollution, and billions of animals, trillions, that are obviously suffering. And so we must continue to, even though this is a very challenging conversation, and I will tell you that last night I got very upset as I was thinking of what to say, and I couldn't even come up with writing a speech. But I have hope, and I was raised in that tradition of hope. And I think it's important for us to translate all of this catastrophe into stories, the power of story and the power of knowledge, and to remain hopeful. And science must do the same thing. People do not connect with data in the way that we think that they do. They connect with stories, and they connect with what influences them and their immediate surrounding. Cultural diversity and context is absolutely critical. We are not going to get everyone on a plant-based diet if we continue to push that, hey, maybe you should have zucchini noodles. This is extremely important. Price and accessibility are not the only reasons as to why people choose what they choose. And I see this a lot in the cell-based movement, in the plant-based movement. If you just make it available and you just make it less expensive, they will choose it. That is just absolutely not true. We cannot have this conversation without including farmers. They're a critical part of the conversation, and I don't mean the people who own the land. I mean the people who work the land. If we're developing these roadmaps to a better future, they need to be at the table, because the person who owns the land, trust me, has absolutely probably no clue on how to move forward to meet these SDGs. Institutions can be an exceptional way to bring about change as well. At Chili Stone Wheels, we work not only in institutions, but in federal procurement. And so education and teaching children not just about systems change, but about that connection to our planet. So the way forward has to be with co-creation, collaboration, and cooperation, with including all of the stakeholders, and at the center, an anti-colonial approach that brings in equity and amplifies and supports indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloísa. Thank you so much, and a lot of points that I could take. And it's really interesting because it's definitely a challenge. And again, I think really putting also farmers in front, and the people that are also the most vulnerable, whether it's to climate change or to food insecurity, is really should be at the key of every process. That's for sure. So yeah, we'll have 2 more speakers, and then if you have questions, also think of maybe your questions. That we'll probably be able to take 2, 3, 4 questions depending on time. But the next speaker will be first Jennifer Behr. Jennifer, you lead the corporate engagement in Choosewege US, a project of international nonprofit organization Mercy for Animals. You work with companies throughout the food industry, advocating for more sustainable and plant-based procurement practices. Jennifer, can you share us some insights on your work and on the role that companies can also play in transforming our food systems?
Yes, thank you. I think that when we are engaging the private sector, something that continuously strikes me and that I find so poignant is just the massive, massive potential of the private sector of the food industry to be a force for fighting climate change. The food service industry in the United States is projected to reach $997 billion in sales in 2023. So the sheer volume and quantity of food that is going into that industry is so massive. If we can harness just a little bit of that volume towards shifting towards plant-based procurement practices, we will see immense, immense dividends in terms of trying to fight climate change and keep global temperatures down. Looking at the restaurant industry specifically, we know that there are roughly 650,000 restaurants in the United States. If each one of those restaurants were to serve a plant-based meal rather than a meal that is heavy in meat and dairy, just one meal for one day, that would reduce carbon emissions enough to drive back and forth across the United States more than 20,000 times. So it's really difficult to overstate the potential for fighting climate change from even modest shifts in procurement practices, particularly when we're talking about some of the largest food service management companies. So the question obviously is, how do we do this? How do we convince these massive companies that investing in plant-based menus and innovation is a worthy cause? I think that the most powerful way to do this is to engage corporate leadership and have very honest conversations about how our goals as advocates, as environmental activists, as animal activists, how our goals intersect with their goals and in fact directly complement their goals in many, many ways. So what do companies care about? Probably the first thing that companies care about is, of course, profitability and competitiveness. We need to build the case to corporate leadership that investing in plant-based innovations and egg allergies, and of course people from different religious and cultural backgrounds, people who prefer different kinds of cuisines. There's just endless upside potential for companies when they think about shifting away from such a heavy reliance on exclusively meat and dairy as a protein source. More on that topic, I think it's also very important to engage company leadership about how protein diversification equals risk reduction. Having a business that is so heavily reliant on meat and dairy carries with it huge inherent risks related to disease outbreaks, price fluctuations, supply chain shortages, and much of this disruption and uncertainty comes from the spread of zoonotic diseases that happens again and again in animal agriculture. We saw this just last year in the most recent outbreak of avian influenza. The price of eggs was up roughly 150% over just a 12-month period. People could not get eggs. The supply chains for poultry were also disrupted and pricing became increasingly unstable. And we see this again and again in bird flu outbreaks, swine flu, even looking back as far as mad cow disease. It's truly not a question of if there will be another disease outbreak coming from factory farms in the United States, but when. And companies that are the most heavily reliant on meat and dairy as, you know, the only protein source on their menu will be most negatively impacted by these price hikes and supply chain disruptions. I think it's also really important when engaging company leadership to also really build the case about how creating sustainable and plant-based menus helps them to meet their other ESG goals. There are hundreds and hundreds of companies, not just within the food industry, but beyond, that have goals to either reduce their carbon emissions within a certain period of time or go completely carbon neutral. And for food businesses, the most impactful and most straightforward way, and quite frankly, a necessary thing that they're going to have to do to cut their Scope 3 emissions is reducing the volume of meat and dairy that they're procuring in favor of plant-based proteins, diversifying their protein portfolio. And you know, they are being held publicly accountable to these carbon reduction goals by their shareholders, their investors, their boards of directors, and ultimately their customers and the public. So that's a huge point of leverage and definitely something that we should be considering. And I'd like to close out with just a recent anecdote about one of Chiu's Veg's recent collaborations. We had the amazing opportunity to work with a school district in Denver, working with the executive chef on replacing all of the animal products in their baked goods with plant-based alternatives. We were able to remove thousands of pounds of eggs and dairy from their supply chain. Very happy to say that the new plant-based recipes went into production earlier this month in time for the new school year. The kids are loving it. It is projected to save the school district more than $13,000 a year. And it's also, I believe, something like 57,000 kilograms of CO2e is being removed from their supply chain for a year. So these plant-based menu solutions exist, they are profitable, they are sustainable, they are actionable for businesses. We just need to build the case for executives and show them that plant-based menus are the solution that they've been looking for this whole time. They just have to put them into practice.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and also for giving concrete examples with very interesting numbers. We'll have our last speaker on the panel, and afterwards we'll take a few questions. So jackfruit-based products which help bring this neglected crop into commercial markets. Prior to joining KARANA, you spent almost 5 years at the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, working on agricultural programs throughout the Global South with a focus on climate-smart agriculture. Ania, so you have you made a job shift into the food and climate startup space from what seemed like a very interesting position at USDA in a big institution. Can you tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to do so? And of course, we'll be also curious about the dumplings we just ate.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for enjoying the dumplings today, and also thank all of my fellow panelists who set up kind of the problem so well, and also some of the ingredients that have to happen around the solution. Because I think that that's the space that KARANA offers, one promising tool on how we can address everything that's already been talked about. So regarding KARANA, what it is and why I decided to make that shift, I want to go back to maybe first and start with some of the discussion that was had about what gets the attention of policymakers to make changes and to create favorable policy towards some of the transition. And as I was at USDA for 5 years, it's a topic that I thought about a lot, trying to understand how we can integrate some of these more of these voices into the programs that we have. And I think my thoughts around this continue to develop and continue to government or policymakers represent the majority, or the majority, maybe not necessarily in terms of numbers, but also the majority economy-wise. And so I always thought that policy kind of precedes change, but as I worked at USDA, I realized that government only moves as fast as the evolution of its stakeholders and the weight of the stakeholders within the within the mix of the stakeholders. And so this kind of answers that question of why I decided to move to a more agripreneurial, plant-based space to drive some of these solutions in the private sector, because as that private sector grows, as the monetary value of that private sector grows, that of these environmentally friendly solutions, then the weight of the voice also becomes more important in the policy discussions, and then it's going to enable the policy to go in tandem with the evolution of the population and the evolution of the stakeholders. So having said that, let me go back to what KARANA is. So KARANA is a relatively young company. The idea started in 2018, 2019. And we were starting to operationalize it right before the pandemic. Thankfully, it's a company that survived the pandemic, which of course is a great feat. And since then, coming out of the pandemic, it's really started to take off. What our goal is to take lesser known crops and figure out how to put them into applications that don't exist right now that help them to be consumed by a broader markets and commercialized more broadly. And we started to do that with jackfruit. And why jackfruit? Because one, it's definitely a gem of a resource that's been untapped. Currently throughout the world, it's produced widely. It has a lot of environmental and social benefits. And about 60 to 70% of jackfruit right now is wasted. So when we just think about that volume across Asia, it is equal to about $1 billion worth of product that is wasted annually. So KARANA is trying to address that and figure out how we can upcycle that into other products that are attractive to consumers. And so what we've focused on throughout various iterations is to create it into a plant-based alternative, and that's the one that you had right now within the dumplings. Your dumplings are stuffed with mostly jackfruit. And so I hope you enjoyed that. you know, very quickly our clients and and consumers are falling in love with the product because it is a little bit, offers a slightly different texture and a taste that is, you know, gaining attention of both clients and both consumers, but also of all of the different companies, cafeterias that you were talking about earlier that want to integrate these types of products into their lineup. I work on sourcing and sustainability at KARANA, and why I very much believe and why the product is such an important solution to food systems transformation is because when we talked already and discussed all of the different, all of the different challenges that we face, jackfruit in one way or another addresses and kind of ticks the boxes of of each one of those challenges. So let me pull up my little list to make sure that I cover all of them. But so first of all, we talked about the need to produce enough food to feed the world. And a lot of the times, as you discussed, this is kind of used as a either or. Either we produce enough or we transform the food systems. Well, jackfruit provides a way in which we can actually do both at the same time. And I'm going to highlight one fact here to underpin that. One really old jackfruit tree produces as much yield as the average 1 hectare of maize throughout the world. So that, I mean, just to stop there, that is incredible. One really old tree. Now, not all trees produce that much because not all of them reach that age. But then if you take the average age of a jackfruit tree compared to 1 hectare, maybe you need 3. So that's still the amount of production per unit of land is very, very impressive. So it's a prolific producer, so it checks that box. Next, what else do we need to ensure? We need to focus on crops that sequester carbon and improve soils. Well, jackfruit is a tree crop. Besides dumplings, we also have breakfast sausages, patties, and a ground that we sell into food service. And I can, unless I'm not aware of another company that does this, our patty is the only burger, plant-based burger you can eat that was grown on a tree. And all of you are an informed audience and understand what the impact of that is compared to where our burgers are sourced from right now. That also contributes to what I believe in very firmly, and that's the reperennialization of our food systems. There's a lot of different initiatives around this. I think it's not talked about enough. But it's something that we really have to pay attention to because perennial crops, tree crops provide so many environmental benefits. Jackfruit is also grown within agroforestry systems, so it promotes kind of food forest type of production. And in terms of sequestration, because it is an under-researched crop, the statistics for sequestration sometimes aren't as pinned down as they are for some of the key commodities. So, but within what already has been researched, we are seeing very, very promising numbers with jackfruit that annually, for example, to other competing crops, tree crops, it sequesters carbon at a faster rate. And because its life cycle is so much longer, that carbon also stays within that crop for so much longer. Next, the other thing we need to address is agrobiodiversity and preserving biodiversity. So how does jackfruit do that? Well, by working with jackfruit, we're helping to diversify our diets with additional crops that we aren't consuming at scale right now. So we're tapping into another agrobiodiversity resource. And how does it promote biodiversity? Because it is grown in food forests. Those food forests end up being extensions of habitats for local flora and fauna in our producing regions. Let's move really quickly through some of the next ones. So what else do we need to do? We need to ensure local food security, and jackfruit also does an excellent job at that. In Sri Lanka, which is one of our sourcing markets, it is a very important crop for food security. I don't know how familiar some of you have been with the news coming out of Sri Lanka over the past couple of years, but they had periods of political turmoil and economic crisis. And in that time, while consumption of all other crops went down, reliance on jackfruit as a food security crop went up. It's actually illegal to cut down a jackfruit tree in Sri Lanka because of its importance to food security. And so in the short term it's providing almost a staple food, and then in the long term it's also an investment because the wood of jackfruit is also quite versatile and usable for many applications. What we also need to do is we need to make sure that farmers are making a living income. And so how do we do that with jackfruit? We have done agricultural diagnostics within our sourcing markets to understand how tapping into this unused jackfruit would result on farmer livelihoods or farmer incomes. And by integrating jackfruit into our supply chain, what we expect to see is a 10 to 40% increase in farmer income because they're now able to commercialize this resource, which was not being commercialized before. And then when we compare the value that's generated on a unit of land compared to some major other commodity crops like cocoa, coffee, mangoes, or avocados, jackfruit is above or rivaling some of those crops. And that's significant. I mean, when you compare it against avocado, for example, there's a reason why avocado is nicknamed the green gold, because it is a significant income generator. And so jackfruit has the potential to do that as long as the offtake markets are there. And then I want to just add one more thing on this topic. I am also the granddaughter of farmers in eastern Poland. And so I'm very well aware of how these changes that we're talking about, these food systems changes, are going to impact producers across the world. And the reality is that 1 billion people earn their incomes right now from animal husbandry activities. And so as we replace meat on plates, we also have to have a plan for how we're going to replace livestock in fields and how we're going to replace livestock incomes in the pockets of producers. And so in the humid tropics where jackfruit is produced, jackfruit provides that opportunity. As we eat more of it, we also incentivize farmers, because of that economic reward, to plant it in place of animal grazing on those lands. So I could continue and go on and on and on, and for any of you that are interested, I'm happy to continue to have this conversation. But for now, I'll end there, and thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ania. And we'll probably have some questions also, like on the dumplings we just had. It was really delicious, so thank you so much. We will now open the floor for some comments or questions. Please just try to keep it relatively short, because we will close at, I think, 55, and then we'll have our friends Charles McNeill from UNEP will also address a few closing words at the end. So I'll start with,
Thanks, Raphael. I'm Patty Fong with the Global Alliance for the Future. So I have two questions, one to David. First, we talked about needing to engage kind of marginalized frontline communities. So I was wondering, the roadmap, I realize it's a very tricky situation. You need data, right? You need evidence. But a lot of the if we talk about science-based targets, the data, the research is not there when it's coming from indigenous people, local communities. So how are you integrating kind of qualitative research, evidence, or engaging the stakeholders so that it is much more inclusive roadmap process? So, all right, one question for you. Second question, maybe for the panel, a lot of discussion around consumer behavior change. And yes, the movement, community-based movement building. However, yesterday I was in a meeting with a lot of corporate presence where this is exactly the narrative that they use. Put it all on the responsibility of the consumer. We haven't talked about food environments. We haven't talked about the amount of money spent on marketing by food companies, by livestock and dairy industry. So that is the big elephant in the room that we haven't quite addressed. It's a bit like, the tobacco industry, right? Just say, well, the consumers can choose. For the last many decades since World War II, that has been building up. So I think we cannot ignore that. We need to figure out how do we build out the bottom-up movement, but also really it's through regulatory policies as well, and shaping the environment so that you consumers actually really have a choice in what they can put on their plate. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. I think we could take one or two more questions, and then we'll get back to the panel if there is more questions to be addressed. In front.
Oh, thank you. I have a question about jackfruit. And I tried eating it in Bangladesh, and it was awful. So I'm just wondering if the kinds of recipes that you've created are being shared globally. Are they open source recipes? Because it was like so striking. Jackfruit was everywhere, and nobody was eating it. But clearly, recipes is a big issue, and I know that's been true with other crops, coming up with really good, tasty recipes.
Marinating.
Thank you.
My name's Erin McGuire. I am the director of the USAID Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture. So really appreciate the point on not enough investment in fruits and vegetables, and I could go on that front. But this piggybacks a bit on the first question. I really strongly agree with the messages around localization and making sure we have the right stakeholders at the table and these systems-based approaches. And so we at the lab spend a lot of time in capacity strengthening, I guess you could say, but really looking to support and enable leadership in West Africa, East Africa, South Asia, Central America. And so I was wondering if you could give us some very specific strategies on how you build the systems in the areas in which you work in order to enable leadership, and move it from global north to global south areas.
Thank you. I think we could take one more if there is. Yeah, one more.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the presentations and the discussion. My name is Lasse. I'm from the UN Foundation. I just wanted to address the issue of global south-north dichotomy we've been discussing here. I strongly believe we need to enable a much stronger south-south collaboration on this issue to be able to be successful. If we continue watching this from a global north perspective of overconsumption here and not relating that to the nutrition deficiency in developing countries, we're not going to get very far. And I strongly believe the voices has to change as well. So looking at, for instance, the next big opportunity, which is COP30 in Brazil, in a couple of years from now, there's going to be so many great opportunities for enabling this South-South collaboration. And adding to that, in G20 next year, a core part of the finance track is going to be about a just agriculture transition. So there are many opportunities to engage there. And I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe also David, any thoughts on how to accelerate any kind of South-South collaboration on this issue specifically?
Thank you, Lasse. So yeah, I think we will probably start. Yeah, we can start with David, as you have to stand up first and to get in front of the camera. So I'll let you answer the first round of questions, and then we'll go through the panel with final thoughts, and then we'll leave it to Charles.
Yes, thank you. So global south, global north discussion, yes, but I will also say we have also to go beyond an opposition between global south and global north. I mean, where do you put China compared to Brazil, compared to Costa Rica or Malawi? I mean that we need to share knowledge, we need to share experience, we need to share technology. At the end, the world will resist and be resilient through diversity. I think there is no one that has the ultimate solution. So we need traditional knowledge. We need also science and innovation. Traditional knowledge never had to deal with a planet with 10 billion people. All the Mesoamerican civilization, when population reached a threshold, they collapsed, you know. Nature reminds you that there is some limits. So sometimes with science we can go over. But really I think we have to keep this in mind, you know. We need a mixed approach on that. So global south, yes. But just to go beyond, you know, this simple vision, global north versus global south, there is a continuum here. And within each country, I mean, you know, Brazil itself is a book. It's a collection of things, you know. Now, on how we, so that's a link to the indigenous knowledge. The roadmap, right, for this first year, it has very high level in the sense that we are not going to tell countries or people what technology, what knowledge they should use. Some of the things that will come to the roadmap is really things have to add up. So at one point, you will need this level of productivity, including for crops, including for vegetables, to be able to combine both the social, environmental implication. How you get there, that's the choice of countries. That's the choice of community, because sometimes actually you need to go infra-countries. So that's why we don't really need to go at this level, because it's not a story about what people should do. It's a people of what people have to do in order to be consistent with the target they have. So, and at the end, the choice of crops also is something that has to be much more regional and localized. And I think this question about, and just want to react about this question, what do we do with the pastoralists? What do we do with people raising animals? I think we need to think that it's not about replacement. I know that some of you want to replace. But the starting point is, if we do nothing, meat consumption is going to be more or less double over 30, 40.
We want is to avoid this doubling with smarter diets, but this means there is a lot of space for traditional production or more modern production. Depending if you care about animal welfare or greenhouse gas emission, actually you may have very different opinions about industrial farming. Okay? So it depends what are your values. I will stop here, but just to say, that's the type of discussion we need to engage.
Solution was there, it will have been done. If people will have make money by selling patties of soybean everywhere, it will have already been done. Okay? It's not the case. Everything has good and bad. You were raising the question of eggs. Yes, they have increased by 110%. In India today, the price of pulses has tripled in some states. Price volatility is part of farming. And with climate change, it's going to be more and more part of that. And so we need to tackle this. But thank you, and more discussion needed.
Thank you so much, David, for this.
Let the panel then with concluding words, maybe 1 minute maximum, as we'll have to conclude.
Sure. I just want to address the question on systems change and just add a little bit on the South-South conversation. I think that is extremely important because we have been leaders from Latin America, and I grew up in that, and we have been leaders in food systems, but the equity conversation needs to happen between those who are
and those who are benefiting, and we see the global north continuously benefit at the expense of others. And we did bring up the systems change. We twice brought up Western colonization and its impact on food systems. And I think you bring a very good point about just the marketing that exists. I'm part of the Health Equity Advisory Committee, a Center for Science in the Public Interest, where we address these things. We could spend an entire panel on this. There are indigenous communities right now in this very country that have to choose drinking soda over water because the water is much more expensive than the soda. And so this is why context is extremely important, and how we address these changes are extremely important because it is very context specific, and it will vary not just by country but even by community within certain countries as well. And we work on procurement at Chili Stone Wheels. We work on institutional change to support those behavioral changes that we want to see, because it isn't as simple as you have a choice, therefore you're going to choose this. Choice is a privilege. It shouldn't be, but it is. And so what we're trying to do is not just empower people. People are empowered. They need the resources to be able to make those choices. So thank you for bringing that up.
So 1 minute on clock. Love this. I'd say the first thing would be thinking about what it means to move forward. Food is an act of resistance. I think it's also a practice, right? And so tangibly coming back to how we can move forward, I think we have to address the loneliness of how our modern societies have allowed us to treat food, right? We're no longer as connected to each other as we eat. Eating is now a practice of nourishment so that you can continue to move forward, as opposed to coming together to be with each other. So those of us who are in places of privilege, who are modeling better food and dietary patterns, I think it's upon us to look at how we can create community through how we cook for each other and bring people into the fold who might be receptive to this idea of wanting to create their own personal consumer behavior change, right? So that we can actually show them that this journey, this transition, isn't one done by staring into the void of the internet and asking Google, how do I eat more vegetables, right? But you experience the joy, you experience the better recipes firsthand, and you get that community woven in together. In terms of my colleague at USAID, indeed, thinking about capacity building in the South-South, one thing that Tzu Chi has been doing really well is working together with faith-based organizations to create the culture change, the consciousness shift within communities, and then bring them into existing infrastructures, whether that's hospitals, to then green those hospitals, create more plant-based structures within those systems, whether it's hospitals, schools, and government institutions, to allow for that transition to be modeled passively, but then showcase the future for what it can be.
Okay. Okay, I'll answer the jackfruit question. So our recipes, unless you want to take the jackfruit question.
No.
Okay. All right, thanks.
The same one with other crops.
Yeah, so our recipe is open source. So we are a company. A private company. So our process, of course, is not something that is going to be completely public, because we have to have a niche product in order to create a business out of it. And so having said that, though, we are a company that built in understanding what impact we will have on producing regions from the very start. And so, and I personally have worked a long time in the cocoa space and understand the difference between, for example, producing regions that were the domesticators of cocoa versus ones where the cocoa was transplanted, and how different those local production economies are. And so we started specifically sourcing in Sri Lanka because it is so well integrated culturally there. And beyond it being an offtake crop, there's a reason why it's there and illegal to chop down a tree, because it's also so important locally. And so as we imagine how jackfruit scales and how it spreads throughout the world, other regions, sometimes those that it's been grown in traditionally and sometimes where it hasn't, what our goal is to make sure is that the way it is introduced in other areas is both a commercialization crop, but also continues to take on local importance. And for example, just this week, I was speaking with an NGO called the Trees That Feed Foundation that does a lot of work with providing seedlings of forgotten crops in many different areas, breadfruit, very prolifically throughout Jamaica and the Caribbean, many other parts in the world, but also some jackfruit. And so what we want to do is make sure that we make these types of partnerships with the NGOs or within our own work that helps producers continue to use the crop locally and make sure that it's used locally, and it is not producers are not just reliant on those offtake markets. But there are many, many different recipes, for example, in Sri Lanka that exist in curries and all sorts of different applications that are very, very delicious. So you don't have to put it through our process to get really good alternative applications for it.
Well, I know we're short on time, so without repeating too much of what's already been said, I think when we're talking about food systems change and the role of consumer choice, we will never see the food systems change that we want to see by looking solely at consumer choice. It's definitely an important element, but we will never see this kind of large-scale change without pulling every single lever that we have at our disposal. And so that means engaging corporate leadership with companies of all sizes, all up and down the food chain, producers, consumer brands, retailers, every sort of company that is at interplay in this system. It also means looking at public policy initiatives at the local, state, and federal level, as well as the international level, and what does the policy look like there. And of course, the role of public engagement and education and advocacy really can't be overstated, because so much of this work does start in communities, and it needs to be holistic. You cannot isolate any single one of those interventions. You need to do all of it all the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, me as well, I wanted to address a bit more about this just agricultural transition that we were talking about, because I do also believe that we need collaboration that goes between sectors and also between countries, and that through that we can address like the injustices that have been carried on like every year and every decade even more, and that we do so addressing as well what we can learn from each other, what we can learn from indigenous communities, because what we are trying to do in Mexico is that we want to bring back all these stories, all these traditions that through colonization and through that process of marketing as well, we were told that our even Mexican food was based on meat, but actually meat was never in Mexico before. So yeah, we want to also bring back all those lost stories that we have been telling ourselves in our small communities, but that also that makes us recognize like the context which each of us are, and to see what is going to work in each context, so we do not put things that are not going to make sense in a context that is different. So yeah, we do need to go across communities, but also within our communities, to be responsible of what we eat and to be responsible to the environment and the earth that is going to be holding all that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panel for also sticking to time. So we'll be almost on time, and we'll have like our last speaker today. Charles McNeill. For 30 years, Charles, you have been a leader in the United Nations, building innovative multi-sector partnerships to solve global environmental challenges. You are currently Senior Advisor on Forests and Climate for the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, an international alliance convened by UNEP to bring faith-based leadership to local and global efforts to end tropical deforestation. Before that, you also manage UNDP's work on forest biodiversity and climate change, sustainable energy, stakeholders engagement, and public-private partnerships. Charles, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll invite you to give us like 5 minutes of final thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, Raphael, and thanks to everyone. Thanks to the organizer. What incredible panelists. I have detailed notes, and I was going to do a complete summary of everything you've said, and I realized the time doesn't really allow that. I'm left encouraged and inspired, and I want to say why. The ideas that were proposed here really need to get to COP28, and we need to help disseminate those. But I want to speak personally for a moment. My career at the UN started at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and since then, my focus for these 30 years has been all about implementing those two conventions. It's been clear that and in the last 15 years, it's been about stopping tropical deforestation and protecting indigenous people's rights, because it's been clear that you can't solve the biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis without solving those issues. I'm a little embarrassed to say that it's only more recently that I've asked the question, what's really driving that tropical deforestation? And the answer is different from country to country where I work, but one thing they have in common is 3/4 of tropical forest loss is caused by agriculture. Beef is a leading driver of deforestation. I was surprised to learn and continue to see that 80% of the deforestation in the Amazon is from cattle ranching. So fortunately, what I see from today's event and elsewhere is there's a growing understanding around the world about the urgency to reduce the damage from our food system for us to have a future, not to mention the millions of other species that depend on a change. As I looked more closely, I saw what I think all of you in this room have known for a while. That is, the way we produce and consume food today really is broken. It's bad for the planet, it's bad for people. And I can't ignore that any longer in my work if I'm serious about solving the climate and biodiversity crisis. As Raphael said, 1/3 of all the greenhouse gas emissions of the food system. If we don't get that under control, the food system by itself will bring us past 2 degrees Celsius. 60 to 80% of the biodiversity loss is attributed to the food system. We're now in the middle of the 6th great extinction event, the first one since the dinosaurs got wiped out. But this time we did it. We're doing it. 1 million of the estimated 8 million species are threatened with extinction. Obesity and hunger. I've learned that diets are the single largest driver of ill health and premature mortality, and the growing body of evidence that a plant-based diet is a powerful way to achieve good health by preventing type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and types of cancer. So I'm getting educated on the topics that you've known about for a long time. Of course, perversely, at the same time, hunger is ravaging more than 800 million people worldwide. So, and since we're here at Climate Week, I wanted to say just a word about what Raphael was saying, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've been following that for decades now. The last installment, an 8-year-long undertaking, 8,000 pages, deeply impacted me. I didn't read all 8,000 pages, but I got the grim report. It shows that with 1.1 degrees Celsius temperature rise, already changes to the climate system we haven't seen in thousands of years. The planet is on fire and it's underwater at the same time. And as Raphael mentioned, the IPCC report also offers hope. It's highlighting pathways to avoid these risks. The report highlights 10 solutions. One of those is eat more plants and less meat. Another, reduce food loss and waste. Along with the obvious ones, retire coal plants and invest in clean energy and energy efficiency. There are all kinds of references. I wrote them all down, but I don't have time to tell you about them. But the IPCC report does give us hope along the lines of what we're talking about today. As I've been doing my day job related to tropical forests and indigenous people's rights, I've been struck by a couple of things that I just wanted to say to kind of wrap this up. One is how gratified I am to learn that the foods recommended most to be consumed for our health also happen to be those that exert less environmental impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, eutrophication, land use, and so on. And we also see those plants that are bad for us are actually characterized by higher environmental impact. We could give countless examples, but one that struck me recently was a study showing that the land required to produce protein from beef is 75 times greater than to produce the same amount of protein for tofu. I could give lots of other examples, but in other words, the foods we need to eat for our own personal health are the foods we should eat for the planet's health. When I realized that, it's kind of a global, almost a cosmic win-win. It changed my life, and 18 years ago, that's when I transitioned to plant-based diets. And I've also been encouraged by recent trends by leveraging plant-based alternatives. Meat consumption has been declining in Germany over the past 10 years from 62 kilograms to 52 kilograms per person. We're also seeing progress in Israel and in the Netherlands. And finally, from my own research and from what I've heard today, 3 final points. One is food will surely be a defining issue of the 21st century. Unlocking its potential will catalyze the achievement of the Paris Climate Agreement and last year's Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Agreement, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. 2, to transform our food system, we know there needs to be widespread, multi-sector, multi-level action and shifts in 4 areas. We've talked about a lot of them today. A substantial global shift towards healthy dietary patterns. David told us about that. That's part of the FAO roadmap. 2, large reductions in food loss and waste. 3, major improvements in sustainable food production practices. And 4, serious action to secure fair, equitable livelihoods for food producers and food workers. And if we do these things, I do believe that feeding the 10 billion people expected by 2050, giving them a healthy diet within safe planetary boundaries is still possible, and it'll obviously improve the health and well-being of millions of people and allow us to pass to our children a viable planet. Let's make this happen. Keep up and intensify the great work we've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, and I want just to thank everyone for coming for this luncheon today in New York. Also, thank you to the online audience that was following on YouTube, I think. Thank you to all the panelists. It was really great to have so many different perspectives. Thank you, David and Charles, also to take the time. We know that it's a very, very busy week. Just a few just 30 seconds concluding thoughts. I think we all understand that there is, a very there is a huge complexity in food systems, involving livelihoods, emissions, many different topics, many different layers. But I think we also know that we have like some solutions. There's no silver bullet solutions, but there are clearly solutions, healthy plant-rich diets and protein diversification, because we mentioned like how to define it, etc. I think protein diversification is an interesting way to define it, even though we would also have to acknowledge nutrition, like all the other aspects that are outside like the simple protein focus. But we know that there is like a general tendency that we can follow, like, and we hope really to see that, I think, in the coming processes and discussions, because it's really great to have like discussions around food systems transformation. But now the question is like, how do we transform these food systems, and what do we, what can we achieve with that? So I think it's definitely a topic that we need to push for a little bit more like this COP, and it's the beginning of a probably long journey, but we hope to really see progresses to mainstream, of course, those healthy plant-rich diets, and to have like healthy diets for all and food security eventually within 1.5. Let's stay optimistic. We can do it. So like that's the message for today. I would like to thank again the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation for providing all this space, and the technique is amazing. The microphones work very well. You have to do that. It would be great to have that at COP also, and so like, thank you so much, everyone, and like, yeah, we'll hope to continue the discussions now with a few more dumplings. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. There are still more dumplings downstairs. If you want to take more dumplings to go or have some more, you're more than welcome to hang out on the first floor for a little longer. Thanks so much.